Winter 1876. At a remote log cabin deep in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, the door exploded inward in a deafening blast. Rifles were already cocked. Sheriff Malachi held up the warrant, his voice dripping with triumph. Evangeline Sinclair, you're under arrest. Gideon stepped in front of her instantly, hand on his revolver, eyes cold as ice. This land isn't under your jurisdiction. A gunshot cracked through the air. He went down, blood spreading across his shoulder. Eva screamed, her heart seizing in her chest. What drove four rugged frontiersmen and a Boston heiress into this life-or-death fight in the frozen wilderness? Don't miss out. Click now to follow the full story. The stagecoach hit a rut, and Eva grabbed the leather strap above her head, teeth clenched, dignity still intact. Barely. Outside the frosted window, Montana Territory looked nothing like Boston. It looked like the end of the world. White sky bleeding into white ground. Pine trees bent double under the weight of the snow. No buildings, no gas lamps, no sign that civilization had ever made it this far west. She pressed two fingers against the glass. The cold bit through immediately. 13 degrees below zero, the driver had shouted down from his perch an hour ago, laughing like it was funny. She hadn't laughed. Evangeline Sinclair had packed 3 trunks for this journey. 2 were stolen at the St. Louis depot. The one she had left held the only things that mattered now, her father's legal documents, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked beneath her spare wool dress. Everything else she owned was either sold or burned courtesy of Sterling Vance and his syndicate of suits and smiles and very quiet cruelty. The Bitterroot stagecoach station appeared through the blizzard like a rumor. A low timber building, smoke curling from a stone chimney, lantern light bleeding orange through ice-caked windows. The driver hollered something she couldn't make out. The horses screamed and stamped. The coach lurched to a stop. Eva climbed out before anyone offered a hand. The cold hit her like a wall. Her breath turned to smoke. Her lace gloves, the frayed ones she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years, were useless. She knew it before her fingers started aching. She knew it the way you know things when it's already too late to change them. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, picked up her trunk with both hands, and walked toward the station door. The advertisement had been specific, if unusual. 4 brothers, Montana Territory. Legal arrangement required under the Homestead Act. Educated woman preferred. Respond to Box 14, Helena Post. She'd read it 6 times before she understood what they were actually asking. Not a wife in the traditional sense. A partner-in-law. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed a married couple to claim twice the acreage of a single man. 4 men sharing one cabin, one claim they needed a legal wife attached to their filing to double their land and lock down the timber and mining rights before Vance's people found a way to strip it. It was a business arrangement, a contract. She had told herself that the whole trip from Boston, the station door swung open before she reached it. Warm air and the smell of tobacco and pine resin rushed out to meet her. 3 men were inside a bartender behind a plank counter. 2 rough-looking travelers warming their hands by the fire. Normal enough. Then the door at the far end opened. 2 men came in from outside, both in heavy coats, both dusted with snow. One of them had a badge on his chest that caught the firelight. Sheriff's star. He wasn't looking at the bartender. He was looking straight at her. The other man behind him had a rifle loose in his hand, held low, the way men hold things when they want you to notice, without making it obvious. He was smiling. She didn't like the smile. Well, the deputy, she assumed he was a deputy, hat tipped back, younger face under the stubble, took a slow step toward her. You must be the lady from Boston. Heard you were coming. Eva set her trunk down. I wasn't aware my travel schedule was public knowledge. This is a small territory. Ma'am, he said. Ma'am, the way some men say it, like a joke with no punchline. Word gets around, especially about a woman traveling alone, especially about where she's headed. I'm headed, she said evenly, to get warm. The man laughed. The other one shifted his rifle just slightly. Neither of them moved out of her way. This was the part she'd been preparing for. She knew it would happen eventually. Men like Vance had long arms. He'd already reached Boston, already ruined her father, already burned down everything her family had spent 30 years building. A stagecoach station in Montana was nothing. She opened her mouth. She didn't know yet what she was going to say. She never got the chance. A third man stepped out of the shadows near the back wall. He was tall, broad through the chest in a way that made the room feel smaller. He wore a heavy coat, dark wool, no ornamentation, and a low-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face. He moved without hurry, no dramatics, just one deliberate step after another, until he was standing between Eva and the two men, his back partially to her, his body filling the space like a door that had just been closed. The deputy's smile dropped. The man with the rifle went very still. Gideon Blackwood. The deputy said the name carefully, like something he'd been warned about. Gideon didn't respond to his own name. He looked at the henchman with the rifle first, then at the deputy, and the look itself was enough. It was the look of a man who had seen actual war and found this two men crowding a woman in a frozen station to be a very small and very disappointing thing. She's the one then, the deputy said, recovering a fraction of his composure, filing under Blackwood's claim. Vance is going to want to... Vance doesn't run the station. Gideon's voice was deep, unhurried. He doesn't run this mountain, and he does not get to run his mouth about this woman through you. The deputy took a half step forward, some stubborn pride pushing him. Now, listen here. Gideon moved just enough, just one small shift of his boot on the floorboard, his weight resettling. That was all. The deputy stopped walking. The silence held for 5 full seconds. Then Gideon reached behind him slowly. No sudden movements, and unclasped the heavy bear fur coat from his own shoulders. He turned and draped it around Eva without asking, without ceremony, like it was the obvious thing to do. It was enormous on her. The fur hem hit the floor. It smelled like cedar and wood smoke and cold air, and something she couldn't name. She didn't say anything. She was watching his face. He turned back to the two men. In Montana, he said, a gun might be shorter than the law, but a woman's dignity stands higher than any mountain peak. He let that sit there for a moment. Now get out of my sight. The deputy looked at his partner. His partner looked at the rifle in his own hand, like he was only just now remembering he was holding it. They left. Not fast, but they left. The station went back to its ordinary sounds. Fire crackling, wind beating against the timber walls. The bartender, who had not moved the entire time, went back to wiping down his counter. Eva looked up at Gideon Blackwood. He was older than she'd expected, 34 maybe, though the scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone made him harder to read. Former military, she guessed. Not from the scar alone, from the way he stood. The way he'd assessed those two men in under a second. The way he'd chosen position before he'd chosen words. Union Army, she'd find out later. Scout, 6 years. He'd come home from the war with 3 medals and enough silence to fill a mountain. You're Eva Sinclair, he said. Not a question, I am. She pulled his coat a little tighter. She wasn't going to pretend she wasn't cold. And you have me at a disadvantage, Mr. Blackwood. You already know who I am. I know your name, he said. I read your letter. You referenced Blackstone's commentaries in the 2nd paragraph. I did. Most people don't do that. Most people haven't read it. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite, not one either. He picked up her trunk, didn't ask, just picked it up and nodded toward the door. The others are outside with the sleigh. Pass is still open for another 2 hours. Maybe 3. After that, the snow closes it until spring. She followed him toward the door. The bear fur coat dragged on the floor with each step. She gathered it up over one arm without breaking her stride. 3 months, she said, at minimum. I see. She pushed the station door open herself. The cold came screaming back in. Then we had better get moving. Outside, through the curtain of blowing snow, she could make out the shape of a heavy sleigh and 3 more figures waiting in the dark. She couldn't see their faces yet, but she could feel their attention settle on her four separate pairs of eyes in the blizzard patient and steady as the mountains themselves. Eva Sinclair had come to Montana, running from everything she'd lost. She did not yet know that she was running toward everything she would become. She walked forward into the storm. The sleigh moved through the dark like a ship through black water. Eva sat between Gideon and a wall of stacked supply crates, the bare fur coat still wrapped around her shoulders, her trunk lashed to the back with rope. The other three men rode in various positions, one driving, two flanking on horseback, and none of them had said much beyond a name and a nod when Gideon introduced them at the station. Thaddeus, Jasper, Bartholomew, who went by Bart, and seemed mildly relieved when she didn't try to say the full name twice. The blizzard swallowed the trail behind them as fast as the horses broke it open ahead. Eva watched the tree line close in on both sides. Massive pines, black against the white dark branches loaded with snow. No stars, no moon, just the lantern swinging from the sleigh's front post and the sound of the wind working itself into a fury somewhere above the canopy. She'd been awake for 19 hours. Her feet were numb. Her back ached from 2 days of stagecoach roads that were more suggestion than infrastructure. She did not close her eyes. She was cataloging. It was what her father had taught her to do in unfamiliar situations. Observe first, speak second, judge last. So she watched the three men she could see and thought about what she already knew. Jasper Sterling rode closest to the sleigh on her left. Half-Cree, Gideon had said simply, as though that was all the introduction the fact required. He moved on horseback like he'd been born there, loose and fluid, tracking the tree line with dark eyes that didn't seem to miss anything. He hadn't looked at her with suspicion, or with the particular brand of male appraisal she'd been bracing for. He'd looked at her the way a man looks at the weather, interested, assessing, no judgment yet formed. Bart was driving, enormous across the shoulders, hands on the reins, like he was holding something delicate. His blacksmith's build was obvious, even under the heavy coat. He'd taken her trunk from Gideon at the sleigh, without being asked, and set it in place with a gentleness that didn't match his size at all. He hadn't said a word, but when she'd climbed up and her boot slipped on the icy step, his hand had appeared at her elbow instantly, steadying her, then withdrawn before she'd even registered. It was there. Thad was behind her somewhere, checking the supply lashings. She'd gotten the clearest look at him under the station lantern. Softer features than the others. Reading glasses tucked in his breast pocket. A medical bag strapped across his back that was as worn and loved as a Bible. 4 very different men, one very cold mountain, and a marriage of convenience that none of them had any illusions about. She appreciated that, actually. The lack of illusion. The cabin appeared without warning. One moment there was only forest, and then the trees broke, and there it was 2 stories of rough-hewn log, firelight glowing from the lower windows. Smoke rising hard and fast from 2 stone chimneys. A covered porch ran the full length of the front. Wood piles stacked head-high on both ends. A barn set back 30 yards to the left, the animals already in for the night. It was not elegant. It was solid. There was a difference, and Eva understood it immediately. Bart brought the sleigh to a stop. Before she could climb down, all 3 men on the ground had appeared beside the sleigh, not competing, not tripping over each other, just moving in the practiced coordination of people who'd been working together for years. Jasper took the horses. Bart took her trunk. Thad appeared at her side with a steadying hand and an oil lantern. "Watch the second step," he said. "Ice. We've been meaning to fix it. I'll remember that." "Watch the third one, too," Bart called from ahead of them. "That one's just rotten." She watched both. Inside, the cabin hit her with warmth like a living thing. The hearth in the main room was enormous, wide enough to roast something substantial, stacked with logs burning full and orange. A rough wood table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Bookshelves flanked one wall, actual bookshelves, double-stacked and overflowing. A map of the territory was pinned above them, marked all over in pencil and red ink. She stood in the doorway for a moment and took it in. "Your room is upstairs," Gideon said from behind her. It was my room. It has the only interior lock on the floor. She turned to look at him. "I moved my things to the ground floor bunk," he continued. He wasn't offering it as something remarkable, just stating it plainly, the same way he'd stated everything else. "The others are on this floor as well. You have privacy and a door that locks from the inside. Use it whenever you want." "Thank you. The arrangement we proposed in the letter stands. You help us hold the land claim legally. We provide shelter, safety, and whatever you need to work. We don't ask anything else from you." He met her eyes. "You are not property, Miss Sinclair. This is a partnership." She held his gaze for a moment. "Eva," she said, "if we're legally married, you can call me Eva." Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Eva." The first week was an adjustment. She wouldn't call it difficult, she'd had difficult. And this wasn't it. This was unfamiliar, which was different. The mornings were coldest. She learned fast that the fire needed tending at 4 in the morning, or the ground floor froze solid by 6. Bart was always already up when she came downstairs, stoking the hearth with his huge arms moving slow and quiet, not talking, just working. He'd hand her a tin mug of coffee without looking, and she'd take it the same way, and they'd exist in the dark kitchen. In a silence that was, she realized by the third morning, not uncomfortable at all. Thad cooked. This surprised her. She'd assumed she'd be taking over the kitchen. It was assumed of women, always, everywhere. But Thad had been feeding 4 grown men through Montana winters for 3 years, and he had systems. She offered to help on the 4th day, and he handed her a knife and a pile of carrots, without ceremony, which she understood as acceptance. Jasper was in and out. He tracked animals, weather patterns, the movements of men at the lower passes. He brought information back the same way he brought venison, quietly and without fanfare, laying it on the table for whoever needed it. Twice in that first week, he came back with news about Vance's men testing the lower road. Both times Gideon listened, asked 2 questions, and made a note on his map. Eva made her own notes. She'd asked for the land deed documents on her second day, spread them across the big table, and spent 6 hours reading every word. She found 3 filing errors that could have been used against them in federal court. She marked them in red ink and left the documents where Gideon would see them. He appeared in the doorway of the main room that evening and looked at the papers for a long moment. "You found the timber easement clause," he said, "and the boundary survey discrepancy on the north parcel, and the missing witness signature on the original claim filing." He was quiet for a moment. Thad was supposed to catch that last one. "Thad is very good at many things," she said. "I suspect contract law isn't one of them." Gideon almost smiled. She was starting to be able to read the almost smiles. "I'll get him." They spent 3 hours that night, all 5 of them around the table, going through the documents together. She explained the legal exposure in plain language. They explained the land in return, which parcels were vital, which were defensible, what Vance was actually after. She'd studied the Homestead Act on the journey west. Knowing it academically was different from understanding it the way these 4 men did, as something they'd built their lives around, something they'd bled for, in more than the metaphorical sense. Gideon had a scar through his left palm from a property line dispute 3 years ago. He'd shown it to her without self-pity, just explaining. Bart had lost 2 seasons of cattle income to Vance's men driving his herd off the south pasture. She told them about her father. She hadn't planned to. But Thad had asked gently, over the remains of dinner, how she'd come to know property law well enough to find what 3 years of filing hadn't caught. And somehow the whole thing came out her father's practice. The mining rights dispute, the syndicate's lawyers, who'd made everything disappear so cleanly that even the judge had seemed unsurprised. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody offered hollow condolences. When she finished, Jasper refilled her coffee. Bart handed her a piece of cornbread. Gideon looked at the map on the wall for a moment, and then said quietly, "Then you know exactly what we're fighting." "I know exactly what you're fighting," she agreed. By the end of the second week, the mountain pass was sealed. A 3-day blizzard buried the lower road under 8 feet of packed snow. Jasper confirmed it on the morning of the fourth-day face, red from the cold, ice in his hair, coming into the kitchen and saying simply, "Pass is closed. We're in until March at the earliest. 3 months, 5 people. 1 cabin." Eva had expected tension. She'd expected friction. The inevitable crowding of people who didn't choose each other's company, the irritability that came with confinement. What she didn't expect was how quickly it became something else. It happened in small moments that she only recognized in retrospect. Thad, leaving medical texts on the table near her coffee mug, when he noticed she'd been reading late. Bart fixing the creaky third step without being asked, and then the second one, and then quietly reinforcing the whole staircase over the course of a week. Jasper teaching her to read the wind through the pines. A high sound meant a front coming. A low one meant it was already here. Gideon drilling her on the fastest route to the root cellar in case of a raid, patient and precise, making her run it twice until she could do it in the dark. She started teaching them things in return. Not because anyone asked, because it felt right. She taught Thad contract law on Tuesday evenings, working through the legal principles that underpinned every claim and deed in the territory. He absorbed it, like he absorbed everything thoroughly and quietly, asking the kind of questions that revealed he'd already thought 3 steps past the thing she'd just explained. She taught Jasper and Bart to read, not from scratch. Both had basic literacy, but to read the way her father had taught her, analytically, pulling the argument out of a text and testing it. She read to Gideon. This was unplanned. She'd been reading aloud one night, working through a passage in Tocqueville's Democracy in America that she'd been chewing on for days. And she'd realized after 10 minutes that he'd set down the rifle he'd been cleaning and was listening with his full attention. She'd kept reading. He'd kept listening. It became a thing they did. 3 nights a week after the others turned in. She would read. He would occasionally stop her to ask a question. Not simple questions, the kind that required her to think. She liked thinking. She hadn't had anyone to think with in a long time. The hearth fire cast long shadows across the room those nights. The wind worked at the walls. Outside was 13 below, 15 below, sometimes colder. Inside was warm and close, and full of the particular texture of a life being built in real time. She was not unhappy. This surprised her more than anything else had. The mountain pass sealed them in like a lid on a jar, but nothing inside was suffocating. If anything, the confinement was doing the opposite, stripping everything down to what was real, what was necessary, what actually mattered. She was starting to understand that those 3 things were the same thing. The foal was 3 days old when it went through the ice. Eva saw it happen from the kitchen window. She'd been up early first light, the sky still more gray than blue, watching the horses move in the near paddock, which was something she'd started doing in the mornings without quite knowing why. The foal, a small dark babe that Bart had been hand-feeding since its mother rejected it, 2 days after the birth, had wandered to the far end of the paddock where the creek ran along the fence line. The ice there looked solid. It wasn't. She heard the crack from inside the cabin. Then the foal's cry, high and panicked and very young-sounding. She was out the door before she'd thought it through. She grabbed the coil of rope hanging beside the porch post. She'd noticed it there on her first day, and Gideon had told her what it was for, and ran. The snow was knee-deep in places. Her boots punched through the crust with every step. The foal was thrashing in the broken ice at the creek's edge, back legs scrabbling, front half on the bank, going nowhere. She got the rope around a fence post, tied it the way Gideon had shown her 3 weeks ago twices, around half-hitch. Don't trust a single loop. Then she moved out onto the ice toward the foal, rope in hand, testing each step before she committed her weight. She got close enough to get her arms around the foal's chest. The ice held. She started pulling. It gave way under her left foot first, then her right. Then the world was water and cold, so absolute that it stopped being cold and became something else entirely, a full-body shock that knocked the air from her lungs and replaced rational thought with pure animal urgency. She kept hold of the rope. She couldn't tell you later how she got out. She remembered the rope. She remembered her hands burning from the cold and still refusing to let go. She remembered the foal scrambling onto solid bank above her and shaking itself. She remembered, vaguely, the cabin door slamming open and Bart's voice from across the paddock thundering her name. What she didn't remember was the walk back to the cabin. The fever had already started. She didn't notice it at first. She was focused on getting dry, getting warm, not letting her teeth rattle out of her skull. Thad was there when she got inside. She didn't know how he'd gotten there so fast with blankets and a change of clothes and that particular calm he carried that made catastrophe feel manageable. "The foal is fine," Bart said from the doorway, snow on his boots, his voice doing something complicated. "Get inside, sit down." "I'm fine," she said. "You're not," Thad said, and his voice was gentle, but it wasn't negotiable. By midday, she was burning. It came on fast, the way fever does when it means business. 1 hour she was sitting by the fire shivering, and the next the fire felt unbearable. And then she was back to shivering, and the room had developed an unsteady quality she didn't like. Thad sat with her and took her pulse and looked at her eyes and didn't say anything alarming, which she recognized as a professional courtesy. His medical bag was open on the floor beside him. He moved through it with the ease of long practice, pulling out small wrapped bundles of dried herbs, a folded cloth, a bottle of something amber-colored. "Fever's high," he said. "Not the highest I've seen, but high enough that we're going to take it seriously." "What do you need?" Gideon asked from across the room. He hadn't moved far from the door since she'd come back inside. He was standing in that way, he had, weight-balanced, watching everything. "Fire kept hot," Thad said. "Clean water as much as you can boil. Bart, I need the chest from the root cellar, the wooden one, second shelf, and I need someone to sit with her in shifts." "Tell us the shifts," Jasper said. He'd appeared in the doorway from outside, snowpack still in his hair, having apparently just gotten back from a morning track. He'd taken in the situation in about 3 seconds and hadn't asked any unnecessary questions. Thad organized it like a field medic, which she suspected he'd been at some point. He gave everyone a job. He prepared policies from the dried herbs yarrow, an elderflower, and something else she didn't recognize, and had her drink a bitter tea that she forced down without complaint because she'd seen enough sick people in Boston tenements to know that complaining about medicine was a luxury nobody could actually afford. Bart kept the fires, both of them, the main hearth and the small iron stove in her room upstairs, which he'd carried wood to without being asked, and which he maintained through the night with a vigilance that never wavered. She could hear him on the stairs every hour or so. The rhythmic thud of his boots, the creak of the stove door, the shift of wood. It was, she realized at some point in the worst of the fever, one of the most comforting sounds she'd ever heard. Jasper was the one who sat closest. Thad had positioned a chair beside the bed and worked out a rotation, but Jasper had taken the first shift and seemed disinclined to leave when his time was up. He sat without fidgeting, without filling the silence unnecessarily. When her fever spiked in the early evening, and Thad said they needed to bring it down, Jasper was the one who wrung out the cool cloth and pressed it to her forehead, her wrists, the back of her neck, careful and unhurried, no self-consciousness about it. "You don't have to do that," she said at one point, half delirious and aware of it. "I know," he said simply. She slept and didn't sleep. The fever moved through her in waves. In the in-between spaces, she was aware of them, all 4 of them cycling through the room, the sounds of the cabin carrying on below, the smell of something cooking, someone's voice low in conversation downstairs. She was aware, in the distorted logic of fever, that she was not alone. Not even for a moment, Gideon didn't sleep at all. She didn't know this until Thad told her afterward, matter-of-factly, that Gideon had stood vigil through both nights, stationed in the chair at the foot of the bed during the worst of it, moving to the doorway when others came in to work, but not leaving. He'd said 4 words to her directly. During those 2 nights, she'd been lucid enough to hear them. "Stay with us, Eva," she had. The fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day. She knew it before she opened her eyes, the strange clarity that follows illness, the feeling of having been wrung out and set back upright. She was exhausted. She was also undeniably still alive. Thad was in the chair beside the bed when she opened her eyes. He looked tired. He'd been awake most of the night, she suspected, though he'd never said so. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Her voice came out rough. "The foal?" He blinked. Then he almost smiled. "Bart's been feeding it every 4 hours. It's fine. Possibly spoiled beyond redemption at this point, but fine." She let out a long breath. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I fell through ice." She pushed herself up slowly, and he helped without making it seem like helping, just a steady presence on her left that she could lean into. "Thad." Did anyone?" She stopped, looked at him directly. "Was I compromised? While I was—" She didn't finish the question. She didn't need to. Thad set down the cloth he'd been folding. He met her eyes with the full weight of his attention, and there was something in his expression that was neither defensive nor offended. It was simply honest. "No," he said, "Eva, no." He held her gaze. "Your physical autonomy is sacred. Forcing yourself on a woman when she is weak isn't manhood. It's the line that separates men from beasts." He said it quietly and without drama, the way you state something you believe so. "Completely, it doesn't require decoration. We were here to keep you alive. That's all we were here for." She looked at him for a long moment. She believed him. Not because she was naive. She was the least naive person in this cabin, possibly in this territory. She believed him because she'd spent 3 weeks watching these men, cataloging them the way her father had taught her, and what she'd cataloged was consistent. They were not performing decency. They were practicing it. Quietly. Continuously. When no one was keeping score, "Thank you," she said. It felt insufficient. She said it anyway. "Don't fall through ice again," he said, going back to folding the cloth. "That would be a much simpler way to thank us." She laughed. It hurt her ribs. She laughed anyway. Gideon was in the main room when she made it downstairs that afternoon, moving slowly, one hand on the wall. He turned when he heard her on the stairs. He looked, she searched for the right word, relieved. He looked relieved in the way that people look when they've been bracing against something for 72 hours, and the thing has finally passed. "You should still be resting," he said. "I've been horizontal for 3 days," she said. "I need to see the sky." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went and got her coat from the hook and held it out without arguing. They stood on the porch together. The cold was still brutal. Her breath fogged immediately, but the sky was clear, for the first time in days, pale winter blue, and the mountains were visible to the north, massive and white, and entirely indifferent to everything that happened below them. She pulled her coat tight and looked at them. Gideon stood beside her and said nothing. He didn't need to fill the silence. He never did. It was one of the things she wouldn't say falling for. She was noting it, filing it, the way he occupied quiet space without making it uncomfortable. The foal appeared at the paddock fence below them, small dark nose working at the cold air. "Bart named it," Gideon said. "What did he name it?" A pause, Boston. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the foal. The almost smile was there, and this time it crossed a little further than usual. She turned back to the mountains, pulled her coat tighter, felt the cold in her lungs and the warmth of the house behind her, and the particular solidity of the man standing 2 feet to her right. She'd come to Montana running. She was still running, technically. Vance was still out there. The legal fight was still ahead. The documents in their oilcloth wrapping were still upstairs in her trunk, waiting. But standing here, watching Boston the foal test, the fence post with one tentative hoof, with the blue sky enormous above the white mountains, and the sound of Thad and Jasper talking in the kitchen filtering through the cabin wall behind her, she understood something her father had tried to tell her once after a particularly brutal case loss. Justice isn't just what you fight for, he'd said. It's also what you build while you're fighting. She was building something here, she could feel it. It was rough-hewn and provisional, and nothing like anything she'd planned. It was also, undeniably, real. The month after the fever was the quietest Eva had ever known. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The cabin had its own rhythms by now, the 4 in the morning fire, the smell of Thad's coffee hitting the air by 5, Jasper's boots on the porch before first light, Bart's hammer from the small smithy shed starting around 8. She'd woven herself into those rhythms, without planning to, the way water finds the shape of whatever holds it. February settled over the Bitterroot like a held breath. The pass stayed buried. The sky went through its moods, clear and brutal, then gray and soft, then a 3-day blow that rattled the cabin windows and drove everyone inside around the main table. They played cards. They argued about land law. Thad read medical texts aloud to anyone who would listen. Bart fell asleep upright in his chair, and nobody woke him. Eva watched all of it and felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. Safe. She felt safe. She didn't say this to anyone, but she stopped waking at 3 in the morning with her heart going fast, listening for sounds that didn't belong. She stopped carrying the documents in her coat pocket instead of leaving them on the desk where she was working. She stopped calculating exits. The men noticed. She could tell from the way they stopped hovering slightly less, from the way Gideon's shoulder check of the room, every time she moved through it, became less frequent. Trust was a thing that moved in both directions. She was learning that. It was Jasper she went with, the first real clearing day in February. He'd knocked on the open door of the main room where she was working. Firewood run. South stand. You've been inside for 11 days. She'd looked up from the land deed amendments she was drafting. That wasn't a question, she said. No, he agreed. She'd gotten her coat. The south stand was a 20-minute walk through snow that came to her knee in the deep spots. Jasper moved through it effortlessly, breaking trail, glancing back just often enough to make sure she was managing without making a performance of checking. She appreciated that. She was managing. She was also breathless, and her calves were burning, and the cold air tasted like iron, but she was managing. The stand itself was a grove of old-growth Douglas fir, massive and dark-barked, the ground underneath them nearly clear of snow where the canopy had kept it out. Sound changed in there. The wind dropped away. It was cathedral quiet, the only noise, the distant percussion of a woodpecker somewhere up high. Jasper assessed the deadfall with a practiced eye and started pointing out the pieces worth taking. She picked up the other end of a long branch, and he looked at her for half a second, then accepted it without comment. They worked for a while in comfortable silence, clearing and stacking. "How long have you been with them?" she asked eventually. "Gideon and the others." 7 years. He set a section of log on the pile with a clean thud. "Came north from Wyoming. Had a run-in with a land agent who thought my heritage gave him negotiating leverage." A brief pause. "It didn't, but I needed somewhere to be for a while after. Gideon gave me work. Then it stopped being just work." She thought about that. "You chose them." "They chose me first," he said. That mattered. She understood that more than she expected to. She'd been chosen here, too. Not for what she came from, or what she looked like, or who her father was. For what she knew and what she could do and who she was willing to be. It was a new experience, and she was still figuring out what to do with it. They were moving back toward the path, arms loaded, when it happened. She stepped over a buried root she couldn't see, and her boot broke through the snow crust at an angle. She went sideways. Jasper caught her arm before she'd fully registered. The fall, his reflexes were something else entirely, and she came up against his side. Both of them stopped, breathing fog into the cold air. He didn't let go immediately. She didn't move away. They were very close. She could see the detail of his face clearly, the dark eyes, the slight crease at the corner, the careful stillness of a man who was very aware of the moment he was standing in. She looked at him steadily. Jasper. Eva, nothing else needed saying right then. They both knew that. But she wanted to say it anyway, because it was true and because he ought to hear it. Blood or skin doesn't measure a man's worth, she said. The kindness in your heart is the only law nature recognizes. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of not knowing what to say. The quiet of someone receiving something they hadn't expected to be given. Your father teach you that? He asked. My father taught me to think it, she said. Montana is teaching me to say it out loud. Jasper looked at her for one more moment. Then he straightened, adjusted his grip on the firewood, and started walking. Come on, he said. Thad's making venison stew, and if we're late, Bart will eat our portions without apology. She laughed and followed him out of the trees. The oil lamp in the medical corner of the main room had a particular quality of light, yellow, and close, contained, like it was trying to hold everything within a few feet of warmth. Thad worked there most evenings after supper, organizing his stores, writing up his case notes, reading. He'd started leaving a second chair there about 2 weeks in. He'd never said it was for her. It just appeared, angled toward the light, and she'd started using it. Tuesday evenings were for contract law. The rest of the time it was more freeform. She'd bring something she was reading. He'd bring something he was puzzling over, and they'd work in parallel. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Both were equally comfortable. One night in mid-February, he set down his text and looked at her over the rims of his reading glasses. Can I ask you something medical? You can try your hands. He nodded toward her right hand, where the scar tissue across 2 knuckles had been visible since her first week. She'd never mentioned it. That's a burn scar, not an injury scar. Fire in my father's office, she said. 2 years ago, his files were there. I got most of them out.
It was quiet for a moment. Did a doctor see it after?
A doctor's assistant. Briefly. He held out his hand, palm up. A question. She put her hand in his. He examined the scarring with the careful attention he gave everything. Medical, thorough, unhurried, impersonal, in the way of someone who had learned to separate clinical from personal as a survival skill. His hands were warm, steadier than she expected for someone who spent as much time outdoors as he did. The secondary scarring healed well, he said. You have full range of motion? She flexed her fingers to show him. Yes, it must have hurt, he said. Not a diagnosis, just an acknowledgement. It did. She looked at her own hand in his. I didn't notice much at the time. I was thinking about the files. You always think about the files. The files are what win the case, she said. The case is what keeps people from being robbed of what they've built. She paused. My father defended 43 families against Vance's syndicate over 12 years. He won 31 of those cases. When they finally came for him, they did it through the courts. Not guns, forged documents, bought testimony, a judge who owed someone a favor. She stopped. He lost the house in October, his practice in November. His health is... She stopped again. Thad had not let go of her hand. He wasn't holding it as a medical thing anymore. He was just holding it. He's still alive, she said, staying with my mother's sister in Providence. He knows I'm here. He knows what I'm trying to do. Does he know you fell through ice? Absolutely not. Thad laughed a quiet, genuine laugh that reached his eyes. We'll keep that between us. He gently set her hand back in her own lap. He raised someone exceptional, Eva. I hope he gets to see how this ends. He will, she said. There was no room in her voice for another possibility. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled, and picked his text back up. She picked hers up too. They read until the lamp oil ran low and the fire settled to embers. Bart never announced his projects. He just started doing them. She'd noticed this pattern weeks ago. The staircase. A new shelf above the wash basin. The latch on the barn door that had been sticking. He identified things that needed doing and did them quietly, without putting it on the table as generosity. It was just upkeep. It was just care, expressed in the language he was most comfortable with. She came into the main room one Thursday afternoon to find him at the table with a set of small woodworking tools spread in front of him, and a piece of pale mountain ash about 4 inches long in his hands. His work-scared fingers moved over it with a delicacy that was always slightly startling from a man that large. She sat down across from him and went back to her drafting. He didn't say anything for a while. She didn't either. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was doing its February thing, a low moan in the pine tops. "What are you making?" she asked eventually. He didn't look up. "Ring." She set her pen down. "A ring. For the filing." He kept working. "Gideon said the federal clerk might ask to see it. Proof of the marriage. We didn't think of it before." She hadn't thought of it either. The legal marriage had been performed by a circuit preacher who'd been passing through at the tail end of November. 3 days before the pass closed a brief, practical ceremony that she'd been grateful for in its lack of sentiment. But they'd had no ring. She'd assumed it wouldn't matter. "The clerk cares about the certificate," she said. "Not the ring, probably." His hands kept moving. Still, she watched him work for a while. He was shaping it from the outside in, the coarse tool first, and then finer and finer, the wood getting smoother under each pass. Mountain ash was pale and close-grained. Under his hands, it was becoming something that had a clean, precise curve to it. "Bart," she said, "you're doing this because you want to, not because of the filing." His hands paused for half a second, then continued. "Might be both," he said. She looked at him. His face was bent over the work, the firelight doing complicated things to the planes of it. He was not a complicated man, in the sense that he didn't perform complexity. What he felt, he expressed through his hands. He'd been doing it this whole time, and she'd been watching it this whole time, and it meant what it meant. "It's beautiful work," she said. "Not done yet. It's already beautiful." He glanced up at her then, just briefly, just one honest second of eye contact, and then back down. But she'd seen it. The same thing she'd seen in Jasper in the South Stand, in Thad under the oil lamp, in Gideon on the porch in the cold. Something was building in this cabin. Something that didn't have a name that polite Boston society had given her. The names she'd been given weren't adequate, and she'd known it for weeks. He finished the ring that evening. Set it on the table in front of her after supper, in the middle of a conversation about spring pasture rotation, as if it were nothing. She picked it up. It was smooth, perfectly smooth. The surface with the quality of something that had been worked and reworked until it stopped being a project and became a thing. It fit her right hand. She wore it. He went back to the pasture conversation without comment. Across the table, she caught Gideon watching not her hand, but her face, and then his eyes dropped back to the map. She kept talking about pasture rotation. The ring stayed on her finger. The near kiss happened because of the weather, and it happened because of all the weeks before the weather. And it was both things at once. There had been a brief thaw in late February, 3 days of above-freezing temperatures that turned the yard to mud and made everyone restless with the possibility of spring. Then the temperature had dropped again overnight, fast and serious, refreezing everything to a treacherous glaze of ice. In the morning, the sky had cleared to that particular, hard blue that only appeared after a fast freeze, brilliant and cold and completely still. Eva was on the porch with her coffee when Gideon came up the steps from the barn. He stopped when he saw her. He'd been checking on Boston, who'd developed a slight cough that Thad was monitoring. He had hay in his hair. She didn't mention the hay. They stood there together in the cold, clear morning and looked at the mountains. The peaks were catching the early sun, burning white against the blue. Below them, the yard was frozen solid, every surface glittering. "Storm's done," he said. "For now. March is variable." He wrapped both hands around his own mug. Could get another blow. Could start thawing for real. "What do you think?" he considered. Another blow, but shorter. She believed him. She'd learned to believe his weather readings. He read it the same way. He read everything through long observation. No wishful thinking. No discount of evidence he didn't like. Gideon. She turned to look at him. When this is over. When we go to Helena and file the amended documents and Vance is dealt with. She paused. What do you want? He turned to look at her too. The sun was full on his face, and she could see it all, the scar, the lines around his eyes that were partly age and partly squinting into too many years of open sky weather, the steadiness that never left him. What do you mean? He said. I mean for yourself, for this place. When there's no fight left to fight, he was quiet. For a moment, the mountains stayed exactly where they were. This, he said simply. He looked out at the peaks, the valley, the timber they'd spent years building. This place, these people, a pause. He looked back at her, and whatever it becomes. He was not talking only about the land claim. She knew it. He knew she knew it. He was very close. The morning was very still. She was aware of everything. His breath fogging in the cold air, the warmth of her coffee mug, the way the light was hitting everything at that angle that only happened for about 20 minutes at this time of year. He leaned toward her, just slightly, an inch, maybe less. She leaned too. The barn door banged open below them. Jasper's voice carried up, sharp and immediate. Gideon. Track on the south fence, fresh. You need to see this. Gideon straightened. His eyes stayed on her face for one more second. Then he set his mug on the porch railing and went down the steps. Eva stood there in the cold morning, with her coffee and her almost moment, and the mountains looking down at everything without comment. She exhaled slowly. Inside, she could hear Thad starting breakfast. The smell of wood smoke and coffee and something cooking drifted through the cabin wall. Bart's voice rumbled something low, and Thad laughed. She looked at the mountains one more time. All four of them. She'd stopped pretending, in the privacy of her own honest thinking, that what she felt was organized or singular or anything she had a framework for. She'd been raised with frameworks. She'd been raised with the language of proper feelings and proper arrangements, and what a woman of her position was permitted to feel. And for whom? The Bitterroot Mountains didn't care about any of that. The pass was sealed, and the winter was long, and she was learning slowly, irreversibly, that the rules she'd been given were not the only rules there were. They were just the rules of people who needed to control things they were afraid of. She went back inside. March came in like a drunk, looking for a fight. 3 days of snow, then a week of sun so strong it turned the south-facing slope to mud, then a hard freeze that made the mud treacherous, then more snow. The cabin sweated through all of it. The roof dripped. The firewood pile on the north porch shrank faster than expected. Bart did 4 rounds of patching on the roof seams and came down each time looking like he'd been personally offended by the precipitation. But by the second week of March, something changed. The thaw that came was different from the false starts before it. It came from the ground up, from the south, and it came steady. Runoff started in the creek. The pine boughs began dropping their loads in intermittent crashes that startled everyone for the first 2 days and became background noise by the third. The yard turned to mud and stayed that way. The mountain pass would open within 2 weeks. Maybe less. They all knew it. They all felt it, the approaching end of the particular sealed world they'd built inside the winter. The legal fight was coming. Helena was coming. Vance and Malachi and federal courts and the full ugly machinery of corrupt frontier capitalism was coming. But that wasn't what made the cabin feel different that week. It was the warmth. After months of cold so absolute that warmth was always rationed, always a thing you earned and maintained and never took for granted, the sudden loosening of it changed the atmosphere inside just as much as outside. Windows cracked open for the first time. Fresh air moved through. The fire in the main hearth, burning continuously since November, was allowed to burn low some evenings for the first time. The cabin felt close, in every sense of that word. Eva had spent months reading these four men, and what the thaw was doing to all of them was not subtle if you knew what to look for. They were careful. They were disciplined, Gideon especially, whose capacity for self-governance bordered on the architectural. They had been nothing but respectful, nothing but measured. But the winter had been long and she was not blind, and she was not pretending anymore about what she felt. The bath was Thad's practical suggestion. He'd pointed out, with characteristic clinical directness, that the mud situation outside meant everyone was tracking grime through the cabin, and that the iron tub needed to earn its keep. He'd set up the bath screen in the corner of the main room, near the fire, the most practical warm spot before supper, and heated the water himself, then vanished with the others to the far end of the cabin to give her privacy. She took her time. The warm water, after months of creek-cold washing and sponge baths, was not a small thing. She felt the tension of 6 months leave her in increments, her hair loose, floating in the water, the firelight through the bath screen, the sound of the men talking low somewhere beyond the door, the ordinary sounds of the cabin at evening. She sat in the tub until the water started cooling. Then she got out. She had a robe of heavy flannel. One Gideon had produced from somewhere in the first week, enormous on her, clearly his. She put it on. She combed her hair out by the fire, standing in the warmth, and looked at herself in the small mirror. Thad kept near his medical corner. She looked different than she had in Boston. Not worse. Different. She'd been a Boston heiress in Boston, a category, a social fact, a collection of expected behaviors. Here she was just herself, after months of being tested and worked and stripped down to what was actual. She wasn't sure she'd trade it back. She heard movement, the sound of boots, then quiet. She turned. All four of them were at the edge of the main room. They'd come back in quietly, not sneaking, just moving, the way they always moved in the cabin, easy and unobtrusive. They'd clearly expected her to be done, to be upstairs, or at the table. They'd run directly into the fact that she wasn't. They stopped. She stood by the firelight in the heavy flannel robe, hair loose and damp, and looked at them. They were going to retreat. She could see it happening in real time. The slight backward shift, the careful neutral expressions, the absolute determination of four decent men not to impose on her space or her comfort or her choices by so much as a held glance. Gideon was already half turning toward the door. Thad had looked at the floor. Jasper had gone very still. Bart's hand was on the doorframe. Months of winter, months of restraint and respect and distance carefully maintained. And now the thaw and Helena 2 weeks away, and what was coming after that was uncertain and large, and she did not want to walk into it, carrying the weight of everything she hadn't said. "Wait," she said. They stopped. Gideon turned back. He was the one she looked at, because he was the one who would understand what she was doing and why, and because he was the one who had the most authority over what happened next in this room. She held his gaze. Then she reached up and loosened the tie of the robe. She let it open, just enough. The firelight was warm and full on her, and she was not afraid, and she was not performing anything. She was just telling the truth with the only language left that she hadn't used yet. Her eyes were steady on his, and she could see in his face the full impact of the moment's 6 months of care and restraint, and a devotion so controlled it had been burning like a banked fire for the entire winter. "Please," she said. Her voice was clear. "Just look." The room went absolutely still. Gideon's eyes held hers for a long moment. She saw everything move through his face, the control, the want, the deep and serious weight of what this meant to him. Not the surface of it, the whole thing, all the way down. Then he took a step toward her. His voice came out low and rough and completely honest. "We can't control ourselves." It wasn't a warning. It wasn't an apology. It was the simple truth of it, offered to her plainly, because he was incapable of offering her anything that wasn't plain. And underneath it was the question, the only question that mattered, which was whether she knew that, and was choosing this anyway. She looked at him, all four of them. Gideon in front of her, Thad to her left, Jasper still and watchful by the window, Bart filling the doorway with his enormous frame and his careful hands. "I know," she said, and Gideon crossed the room to her. What happened next was not fast. It was not urgent in the way of desperation. It had the quality of something that had been building for long enough that when it finally arrived, it moved with its own deep gravity, deliberate and inevitable. Gideon reached her and stopped, one hand rising to her face, his palm against her cheek, calloused and warm, his thumb at her jaw, and just looked at her for one more long moment, making sure. She held his gaze and didn't look away. And he understood. He kissed her like a man who had been thinking about it for 3 months and had strong opinions. Thad came to her left side, and his touch when it arrived was what she expected from him, gentle and unhurried, his hand at her shoulder first, and then drawing her hair back from her face with the focused attention he gave everything, as if this too was something he intended to do properly. He pressed his mouth to her temple, her cheek, and when she turned toward him, he was there. Jasper didn't move toward her immediately. He waited until she looked at him, until she was the one who reached out a hand, and only then did he come close. His hands were sure, and his eyes, when they met hers, were completely open. No performance, no guard up, just the same directness that had looked at her in the south stand and called her by her first name and broken trail through deep snow without needing to be thanked for it. Bart was last. He came to her with the same quality of care he brought to everything he built, slow hands, certain no wasted motion. He was so much larger than her that when he put his arms around her, the rest of the room seemed to recede. He was warm and solid, and she could feel his heart under her palm when she put her hand against his chest. Fast. His heart was going fast. She found that more moving than she expected. They moved to the fire and the blankets and the warmth of the cabin's main room, all 5 of them finding a shape together that felt less like something new and more like something that had been waiting to be named. Gideon's hands on her were steady and deliberate. Thad's were tender, always checking, always attending. Jasper was the one who made her laugh once, unexpectedly, in the middle of it, and she laughed freely without embarrassment, and he grinned at her with every wall down. Bart held her like she was something worth holding, and that was exactly what it felt like. What happened between them was intimate and real and serious, and also, somehow, not heavy. It was joyful in a way she hadn't anticipated. 5 people who had spent months learning each other's truths, and this was just the last truth, the one that lived below language. They lay by the fire afterward. The spring night was warm enough that they didn't need anything beyond each other and the low-burning hearth. Someone, Thad, had produced a blanket. Bart had wordlessly put more wood on the fire. Jasper had his back against the old settle, Eva's head against his shoulder, looking at the ceiling. Gideon was the last to settle. He sat at the edge of the group for a moment and looked at all of them the way he always assessed a situation, taking in the full picture, and something in his face was different than it had been. For the 6 months she'd known him, the vigilance was still there. It was always going to be there. But under it, for the first time, was something quieter, something that didn't need to be defended. She reached out her hand toward him. He took it, lay down beside her, and for a few hours, in the warm dark of the spring cabin, all 5 of them slept. Dawn came gray and gentle through the east windows. Eva woke first. She lay still for a moment and listened. Bart's slow breathing, Jasper's arm loose across her waist, Thad's glasses folded neatly on the floor. Near his head he'd folded them, even in the middle of all that. Gideon with her hands still in his, already half awake, eyes not open, but his breathing shifted. She looked at the ceiling. The fire had burned to embers. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and pine, and the warm, particular smell of people who had chosen each other. She thought, this is what I'll fight for. Not the land, though the land mattered. Not the documents, though they would win or lose everything in a federal court. Not even her father's dignity, though she would never stop fighting for that. This exact thing. What happened when people decided to be honest with each other and decent toward each other and brave enough to love without the permission of people who feared them? The thought was still warm in her chest when the cabin door exploded inward. The sound was enormous. Wood and iron gone in one blast. Cold morning air rushed in, and then voices, shouting, boots on the porch, boots in the doorway, the metallic precision of rifles being readied. Everyone was moving before the door had finished falling. Gideon was on his feet and had his revolver in his hand in less time than it took Eva to register what was happening. Jasper rolled left, putting the settle between himself and the door. Bart surged up and forward, putting his body between Eva and the entrance, massive and instinctive. Thad grabbed his medical bag and his rifle with one motion that suggested he'd thought about this sequence before. In the doorway, backlit by the pale morning, stood Sheriff Malachi, 6 men behind him, all armed. And behind them, just visible at the porch edge in a dark coat and a hat that cost more than the cabin, Sterling Vance. Malachi had a piece of paper in his hand. He held it up with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time for this moment. Evangeline. "Sinclair," he said, "I have here an emergency arrest warrant signed by the Territorial Court of Beaverhead County." His eyes moved across the room, the blankets, the fireplace, all 5 of them, and his mouth did something ugly. "Charging you with prostitution and with the theft of proprietary documents belonging to the Vance Mining Syndicate." He let that sit. "Come quietly, and there won't be any trouble." The cabin was utterly silent. Eva stood up. She was still in the flannel robe. Her hair was loose. Her feet were bare on the wooden floor. She looked at Malachi, and she looked at Vance behind him, and she felt something move through her that was not fear. It was fury. Cold and clear and very useful. Gideon stepped forward, putting himself between her and the doorway. His revolver was at his side, not raised, but present. His voice was the calmest thing in the room. "That warrant," he said, "was signed by a county court. This land is under federal homestead filing. You have no jurisdiction here." "I have 6 guns," Malachi said. "So do we," Jasper said quietly, from behind the settle. The standoff held for 5 full seconds. Then one of Malachi's men, nervous young, the bad combination, shifted his rifle. The crack of a shot. Gideon went sideways, his left hand going to his right shoulder, and Eva heard herself make a sound she hadn't made since Boston. "Fall back," Gideon said, voice flat and immediate, like a man who'd been shot before and knew it wasn't over. "Cave system. Now. Move." They moved. The cave was cold and dark and smelled like 10,000 years of mountain. Gideon found it without hesitating, which told Eva he'd known about it for a long time. He'd known about it the way he knew about everything on this mountain, not because someone told him, but because he'd walked every inch of it and filed it away against the day it would matter. It mattered now. They got in through a narrow slot in the rock face behind the north tree line, barely wide enough for Bart's shoulders. He turned sideways and scraped through with his teeth clenched and said nothing about it. Jasper went first with the rifle and the lantern. Then Eva, then Thad with his bag. Gideon came last, moving slow, his right hand pressed against his left shoulder where the blood was coming through his fingers dark and steady. He didn't complain. He didn't fall. He just kept moving. The cave opened up about 20 feet in. The ceiling rose to maybe 9 feet in the center, and the floor was dry, mostly with a flat section near the back wall where the rock was smooth. Jasper had the lantern up and was sweeping it before anyone else had their footing. "Clear," he said. Thad was already going to Gideon. "Sit down," he said, and this time it wasn't gentle. It was the voice he used when he was working, not the voice he used around the supper table. Gideon sat. Thad got the coat off him and the shirt underneath and looked at the shoulder for maybe 4 seconds before he started working. "Through and through," he said. "You're lucky." "I don't feel lucky," Gideon said. "You're alive." "That's lucky." Thad pulled cloth from his bag. "This is going to hurt. Get on with it." Eva had her back to the cave wall, and she was watching all of it. and doing what her father had taught her to do. Observe. Catalog. Don't panic in front of people who are watching to see if you'll panic. Her hands weren't shaking. She was aware of this and chose to take it as useful information about herself. Bart had set the supply pack down and was going through it fast, pulling out what they had. 2 blankets, a tin of dried meat, shot and powder, the oilcloth bundle. She recognized the oilcloth bundle. She'd wrapped it herself. The documents made it, she said. Of course they made it, Bart said. He set the bundle carefully against the cave wall like it was fragile, which it was, in its own way. Outside, muffled by rock and distance, they could hear shouting, men's voices. Malachi's operations spreading out from the cabin. They were methodical. She gave them that. Vance spent money on competence when it suited him. He'll burn the timber, Jasper said from the cave entrance. He was watching through the slot without putting himself in the opening. South stand first. To push us out. He'd burn the whole claim, Eva said. If he can't have it. Yes, she thought about the south stand. The cathedral quiet in there. Jasper's footprints in the snow beside hers, the woodpecker somewhere up high. She felt something hot move through her chest and recognized it as rage. Good. Rage was useful. Fear wasn't. Not right now. Gideon made a sound while Thad worked on the shoulder, and then went quiet again. His jaw was set. His eyes went to Eva once, briefly, checking on her the way he always checked on everything. She held up 2 fingers. I'm fine. He nodded and looked back at the cave wall. The first smell of smoke came about an hour later. Jasper reported it without drama. South stand burning. Winds from the west, so it'll push toward the north tree line, but not reach us. He paused. Not quickly. How long? Gideon asked. He was sitting up, shoulder packed and bound, moving slower than usual, but moving. Hours, maybe until dark. Then we have until dark to think. They had more than that. They had Eva, which Vance had apparently not fully accounted for when he drew up his plan. He'd thought he was coming for a Boston heiress and 4 frontier men. He'd come for a lawyer who happened to be wearing a flannel robe. She was already working through it. He needs the documents, she said. He doesn't need me. Not really. The prostitution charge is a mechanism to discredit anything I might testify to about the land fraud. If those documents reach a federal court intact and verified, his entire claim to this territory collapses. Then he burns the documents, Bart said. He can't. He doesn't know I have the copies. Gideon looked at her. Copies. I made copies in my second week here. You had paper. I had time. She kept her voice even. The originals are in the oilcloth. The copies are sewn into the lining of my trunk, which is, presumably, still in the cabin. Silence. You planned for being raided, Jasper said. It wasn't quite a question. I planned for Vance, she said. He's been doing this for 12 years. I assumed he'd find us eventually. The only question was when. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. How do we get the trunk? We don't. The copies are insurance. The originals are here. She touched the oilcloth bundle. We need to get them to the Federal Circuit Court in Helena. Everything else is noise. Gideon started to say something. Thad cut him off. Not tonight. You're not going anywhere tonight. Shoulder needs 12 hours minimum before you put stress on it. Thad, 12 hours, Gideon. Argue with me and I'll make it 24. He didn't argue. The night was long and cold, and they made no fire, which was harder than it sounds after months of the main hearth burning continuously. They shared the 2 blankets and the dried meat, and nobody talked much. Jasper kept watch at the entrance. Bart piled rocks near the slot, not blocking it, just creating a barrier that would buy seconds if someone found the opening. Thad monitored Gideon's shoulder every few hours with the efficiency of someone who had done night triage before and didn't need light to do it. Eva sat with her back against the rock and the oilcloth bundle in her lap and thought about the federal filing procedure for the Beaverhead district. She knew it. She'd memorized it on the Stagecoach West. She went through it now, step by step, identifying the weak points, identifying the arguments Vance's lawyers would use, and the counter-arguments that would defeat them. She was still thinking When dawn came gray through the cave slot, she was the one who stood up and said, "I'm going." Every head turned to Helena. With Jasper, we file the amended documents with the Federal Circuit Court before Vance's lawyers can get there with whatever fabrication they're planning. She looked at Gideon. You and Thad stay with Bart. He can't ride. Not yet. Bart's fine, Bart said. You are not fine, Thad said, in his not negotiable voice. She looked at Jasper. He met her eyes and nodded once. He'd already figured it out before she'd said it. He usually had. There's a problem, Gideon said. His voice was controlled. She knew what that control was costing him. You ride into Helena as yourself. Malachi's people will have you before you reach the courthouse steps. Then I won't ride in as myself. She'd thought about this, too. They found what she needed in the supply pack. Men's clothes, a spare set of Jasper's, which fit her better than Gideon's would have. She braided her hair tight and tucked it under a flat-brimmed hat. Thad found charcoal in the bottom of the pack and used a careful thumb to add shadow to her jawline. Nothing dramatic, just enough to read wrong at a distance. She stood in the cave entrance in the gray morning light and looked at the four of them. Gideon was watching her with something in his face she didn't have language for yet. She was starting to think some things didn't need language. This land claim and everything we've built on it, I'm going to protect it, she said. All of it. He held her gaze. I know. Don't get shot again while I'm gone. The almost smile, crossing further than usual. I'll consider it. Jasper already had the horses. They went out through the back way, through timber still standing, north of the burning, and by the time the sun was properly up, they were on the old Cree track that cut toward Helena through the high country, where Vance's men wouldn't be watching. They rode hard and said little for the first 4 hours. The track was narrow, and the footing demanded attention. Eva had learned a lot about riding over 6 months on a mountain, and she had learned most of it the way she'd learned most things out here, by needing to and having enough sense not to pretend she could afford to fail. They stopped at midday at a creek crossing to water the horses. The smoke from the burning timber was visible to the south, a thin brown column rising into the clear sky. Thinner than she'd expected. It didn't spread far, Jasper said, reading her look. Wind changed, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. South Stand is gone, though. She thought about the woodpecker. The cathedral ceiling of old growth. She breathed in once through her nose and breathed out again. We'll plant it back, she said, slower than Vance can burn things. But we'll plant it back. The Cree settlement was 2 hours past the creek crossing, a cluster of structures tucked into a valley fold that didn't appear on any of Vance's maps, because the people who made Vance's maps hadn't known to look for it, or hadn't cared to look carefully. Jasper was recognized before they reached the outer edge. A boy of maybe 12 came running out, and Jasper swung down from his horse and spoke in Cree for a minute, while Eva waited, and then they were being waved through. The elder, who came out to meet them, was a woman of maybe 60 with eyes that assessed Eva completely in about 3 seconds. She said something to Jasper. She wants to know if you're the Boston woman, Jasper said. Tell her I'm whatever helps. He translated. The elder looked at Eva again. Then she smiled. She said something else. She says Gideon helped her grandson out of a land dispute with a timber agent 4 years ago. Jasper's voice was level. She says the Blackwoods keep their word, and so she'll help us keep ours. This was what happened when men spent years being decent to people who had no power to reward them for it. Eva understood the arithmetic of it completely. You don't do right by people because you'll need them someday. But you will need them someday, and then they'll be there. They 2 hours. They ate. Their horses rested. The elder's daughter, who turned out to speak excellent English and have a sharply practical knowledge of Helena's street layout, talked Eva through exactly which route to the federal courthouse avoided the sheriff's office line of sight. When they left, they had a letter of testimony from the elder confirming the Blackwood brothers' long-standing peaceable relationship with the Cree community, signed and thumbprinted. Eva tucked it inside her coat with the oilcloth bundle and didn't let go of either one. Helena was 3 hours further north. They reached it in the late afternoon, the city spreading out in the basin below them, the gold dome of the territorial building catching the last flat light. She'd thought Boston was civilized. Helena was just a different kind of roughness dressed in more expensive clothes. They didn't enter together. Jasper went in from the east toward the livery, pulling both horses. Eva went in from the west, walking, hat down, the way she'd watched Jasper walk through spaces where he didn't want to be noticed loose, purposeful, eyes moving without obviously moving. Nobody stopped her. The Federal Circuit Court building was 2 blocks from the territorial office. It was smaller than she'd expected and had a list of office hours nailed to the door and a clerk inside who was very tired and very young and was clearly hoping his Thursday afternoon was nearly finished. She set the oilcloth bundle on his counter. I need to file amended land claim documents for Gideon Blackwood and associated parties, Beaverhead County, under the Homestead Act of 1862. I also need to file a counter-complaint against the Vance Mining Syndicate, citing fraudulent boundary claims, forged documentation, and unlawful interference with a federal land filing. She slid the bundle toward him. I have originals, copies, and witness testimony. I'll wait while you verify. The clerk looked at the bundle. He looked at her. He looked at the bundle again. Who are you? He said. She took off the hat. Let him see her clearly. I'm Evangeline Blackwood, she said, and I am asking you to do your job. He did his job. He was still doing it 2 hours later, with a second clerk called in from another office, and 3 oil lamps burning against the fallen dark, when the last document was stamped and entered into the federal record. When she walked out into the Helena night, Jasper was on the steps. He'd known somehow how long it would take. He handed her a tin cup of coffee that was still hot. She took it, took a breath, looked up at the stars over the territorial basin. It's filed, she said. Jasper said nothing for a moment. Then Vance finds out by morning. Yes. She drank the coffee. So we move fast. They slept a few hours in a boarding house where the landlady asked no questions and charged fair rates. And before dawn they were back on the high track heading south, riding toward whatever was left of home. She had no idea what they'd find, but she knew what she'd filed, and she knew what it meant. And she held that the whole long ride back like a coal kept lit against the cold. They smelled the smoke before they saw anything. Different smoke than the south stand burning. This was sharper. Closer, the smell of things that weren't wood canvas, leather, the particular chemical bitterness of lamp oil caught by flame. Jasper pulled up on the track and put his hand out. She stopped. He listened with his whole body in that way he had, still as a fence post, reading the air. Movement, he said, south of the tree line. They're still here. How many? More than yesterday. He glanced at her. Vance pulled in more men. She thought about the filing, about the federal record with its stamps and its witnesses and its ironclad chain of documentation. Even if Vance burned everything on this mountain, the papers in Helena were already beyond his reach. The land was protected. The claim was locked. What wasn't protected was the 4 men sheltering in a cave behind a burning timber stand. They went in from the north, through the rock country above the cave, which added an hour to the approach and required leaving the horses and going the last half-mile on foot through snow that was soft and deep with the spring thaw. Eva's legs were burning by the time Jasper found the back way into the cave system. He tapped on the rock 3 times, waited. 2 taps back. They went in. The cave was the same cold dark. 3 lanterns now, not 1. Thad had done something to Gideon's shoulder that involved a lot of clean cloth, and Gideon was sitting up straight and looked irritated about being stationary, which Eva recognized as a good sign. He turned when she came in. It's filed, she said before he could ask. Something went out of his face, the thing that had been holding it rigid for 12 hours. He breathed out once, slow and controlled. Federal record, he said. Stamped, witnessed, Entered. Counter-complaint against Vance included. We also have a letter of testimony from the Cree settlement. She looked at him. It's done. The land is protected. Then what Malachi has is worthless. He doesn't know that yet. Bart was on the far side of the cave, sitting with his back to the wall, which was where he'd been when she left. In the better light, she could see he'd taken a graze along his ribs. At some point, a long scrape, red and ugly. The shirt cut away, and the wound cleaned. He wasn't holding himself carefully the way you held yourself when something was badly wrong. Just mildly carefully. When did that happen? She said. Yesterday evening, Thad said. A man got too close. Bart dissuaded him. He shot at me first, Bart said. Did you dissuade him with your fists? Jasper said. Or with the timber axe? Fists, Bart said. A pause. Mostly. Thad's expression said he had feelings about this that he was choosing not to voice right now. Eva sat down. She let herself be still for a moment, just one moment before she went back to thinking. Her legs ached from the mountain approach. Her eyes were gritty from 2 bad hours of sleep in the Helena boarding house. The oilcloth bundle was safely in Jasper's pack now. The filed copies with the federal clerk, and she allowed herself to feel, briefly, the full weight of what they'd done, and then set it down and move on. He's going to push tonight, Gideon said Vance. He knows he's losing time. Every day that warrant goes unanswered weakens his position. So what does he do? Eva said. He stops being careful. Gideon looked at the cave entrance. Sends more men, less precision, more force. He needs to have something to show by morning. Then we need to be somewhere he doesn't expect. Jasper was already looking at her. They worked it out together, the 5 of them around the lanterns. It took about an hour. It wasn't elegant. Elegant wasn't available. What they had was a mountain they knew better than Vance's hired guns. A federal filing that meant Vance was fighting a losing fight, and the clock was running, and one captured lieutenant that Bart had been keeping in the back of the cave, tied to a rock outcropping since the previous day. The lieutenant's name was Creed. He was lean and practical looking, not the worst man they could have pulled from Vance's operation. He'd been quiet, watching, calculating his odds, and apparently finding them insufficient to make a move. Eva went to him. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man reassessing a situation he thought he'd understood. You're the woman from the warrant, he said. I'm the woman who filed the federal counter-complaint this morning, she said. The one that voids the warrant, nullifies Vance's claim, and names him personally in a fraud case with enough documentation to bury him. She crouched down to his eye level. Where are you from, Mr. Creed? He blinked Nebraska. You have people in Nebraska? Sister, he said. Her family. Then I'm asking you to think about them while I tell you what's coming. She kept her voice level. Vance is already a federal case. Anyone in his employ who participated in the raid on this property is potentially liable for the charges attached to that case. That includes you, she paused. Or you tell me what I need to know about his operation, and I make sure your cooperation is in the record. Creed looked at her for a long moment. He's got 11 men in the south pasture, he said. 3 at the lower road. 2 watching the cave entrance. They don't know about this entrance, just the main one. He's planning to push at dusk. He wants the woman and the documents, in that order. He paused. He's nervous about the documents, more than he's letting on. He should be, Eva thought. They used everything he told them. Jasper went out first alone, through the back way, circling wide through the north timber. He was going to do what Jasper did move through terrain, without being seen, make noise where he wanted noise made, draw attention toward places that mattered less than where they were actually going. He squeezed Eva's hand once before he went, quick and sure, and was gone. Gideon went to the cave entrance, the main one, the one being watched, and set up a position behind the rock barrier Bart had built the night before. He could cover the mouth from there, without being in it. He was moving slow on the left side, but he was moving. Gideon, Thad said. I know, Gideon said. Shoulder. I know, Thad. If you tear the packing open, I'm letting it stay torn until this is over. Fair, Gideon said. and took his position. Bart went to Eva and Thad. He was the physical wall. He'd been the wall since the first moment she arrived in Montana, and he wasn't going to stop being it now, torn up ribs or otherwise. If anyone gets through the main entrance past Gideon, he said to Eva, you go to the back slot. You go through and you run north. Don't wait for us. I'm not Eva, he said it gently, but there was iron underneath it. You have the federal documents. You're the case. Without you and those papers, none of this matters. If we lose the cave, you run. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that steady patience that never wavered, the same patience he brought to the staircase and the ring, and every slow and careful thing he'd built. All right, she said. He nodded. It started at dusk, the way Creed had said it would. The first sound was men in the timber. Not subtle. Vance wasn't being subtle anymore. She could hear them through the rock boots. Voices, the specific sound of men moving fast through snow that didn't know them. Shots from the cave entrance. Gideon, controlled and precise, not wasting ammunition, making every round account for something. Shouting from outside. More shots, closer together, and then Jasper. Somewhere from the north, a sound that scattered the attention of whoever was coordinating the push. A man came through the cave entrance at a run. He got 2 steps in before he understood where he was, and another half step before he saw Thad. And he was raising the rifle in Thad's direction, and Thad was already moving, but not fast enough, and Eva had her Colt in her hand, and she was not thinking. She was not feeling. She was doing what was necessary. The shot cracked off the cave walls like a thunderclap. The man went down. Not dead. Shoulder. He hit the cave floor and stayed there, making noise. Thad looked at her. She looked at the man on the floor, then at the Colt in her hand. She felt a lot of things, and filed all of them away for later, because later was when she would have the space to feel them properly. Right now, she handed Thad a length of rope from the supply pack, and he trussed the man's wrists before he could collect himself. Good shot, Thad said quietly. Thank you, she said, and meant it practically. The shooting outside was heavier for about 10 minutes. Then it thinned, then it stopped. The silence afterward was enormous. Jasper came back first through the main entrance, snow in his hair, breathing hard, blood on his left sleeve that he said was not his, and they had to take his word for it. South pasture group is scattered, he said, 4 down. 2 ran. The rest fell back to the lower road. He looked around. Lower road group had a change of heart when the south group fell apart. They're gone, Vance, Gideon said from the entrance. Wasn't with them, he directed from the lower road. Jasper's voice went flat. He had his horse ready. He rode when it went wrong. Of course he did. Men like Vance didn't put themselves in the cold and the dark with the rifles. That was what hired men were for. Where does that leave us? Eva said. It leaves us with the mountain and the federal filing, and a case that gets heard in Helena, Gideon said. He was leaning against the cave wall, left arm held close to his body, and he was pale under his coloring, but his eyes were completely clear. And it leaves Vance running from a warrant instead of issuing one. She nodded. Then she heard Bart. He made one sound, one sharp breath, not loud. She turned. He was down on one knee in the back of the cave. His hand was pressed against his side, lower than the earlier graze, and the dark spreading through his shirt was not a graze. Somewhere in the fight at the cave entrance she hadn't been watching. Something had reached him, a Ricky, she'd find out later. Bad angle, lucky for whoever fired it, and very unlucky for Bart. She crossed the cave before she'd made a decision to move. Bart, she got down beside him. Look at me. He looked at her. His face was very calm. That was almost worse than anything else would have been. It's not nothing, he said. No, she agreed. It's not nothing. Thad. Thad was already there. He was already working. He had Bart on his back, on the flat rock and the lantern close, and his bag open, and his voice was completely steady. The voice of a man who had worked on bad wounds before in bad light, in bad circumstances, and had learned long ago that falling apart was a choice he didn't make. Eva took Bart's hand. He looked at the cave ceiling. His breathing was careful, measured. She could feel his pulse under her fingers, and she watched Thad's face for information and read it the way she read. Everything Thad did carefully, looking past the professional calm for what was underneath. Thad caught her eye over Bart's chest. He gave her a very small nod. Not fine, but possible. She held Bart's hand tighter. Boston, Bart said. She frowned. What? The foal. His voice was slower than usual. You never told me if you liked the name. She looked at him. At this enormous, careful, deliberate man who had built things for her without asking credit, who had handed her coffee without making ceremony of it, who had held her through the winter dark, with a heart going fast under her palm. I love the name, she said. His hand stayed in hers. Good. Thad worked for 2 hours. She stayed beside Bart the entire time, not holding him still. He was still on his own. It was who he was, but present. There Jasper took a position at the cave entrance. Gideon sat across from her against the cave wall, shoulder-packed and his eyes on Bart's face, steady and watchful, and saying nothing because there was nothing useful to say. When Thad finally sat back on his heels and said the bullet was out and the bleeding was under control, the cave was very quiet. Bart let out a long, slow breath. 12 hours. Rest, Thad said. Tell me 24, Bart said. I want to sleep. Thad almost smiled. 24. Bart closed his eyes. Eva looked around the cave. Gideon, pale and holding. Thad, exhausted and steady. Jasper at the entrance, snow-dusted, watchful. Bart with his eyes closed and his chest rising and falling with something that would become, in a few days, a full recovery. She thought about what Bart had said before the fight. You are the case. Without you and those papers, none of this matters. He was wrong about one part. He'd put his body between her and a cave full of armed men hired by a syndicate that had already destroyed one family she loved. That mattered. That mattered in a way that had nothing to do with land deeds or federal courts or any document she'd ever held. She set his hand down carefully. All right, she said, and her voice was steady. Helena, the trial. We go when he can ride, not before. She looked at Gideon. We end this. He met her eyes. Yes, he said. Outside, the spring dark settled over the mountain. The smoke from the south stand was gone. The snow was melting at the edges, soft and slow. The way things melted up here, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily and without stopping. They were still there. All 5 of them. That was what mattered. That was what they'd fight to keep. Bart could ride on the 5th day. He said he could ride on the 3rd day, and Thad told him to try it and see what happened. And Bart looked at Thad's face and decided to wait. By the 5th day, even Thad agreed. The wound was clean. The bleeding had stopped on the 2nd day and stayed stopped. Bart's color was back, and his appetite was back, and he'd spent the 4th day quietly rebuilding the rock barrier at the cave entrance because he needed to be doing something with his hands, and lying still was not something he was built for. Eva had spent those 5 days working. She had the documents. She had the federal filing confirmation that Jasper had secured from the clerk before they left Helena, and she had 5 days of cave, quiet to construct the legal argument that would end Sterling Vance. She wrote on whatever she had, blank margins of a surveying pamphlet Thad had in his bag. The back of Creed's statement, which she'd written out formal and had him sign before Jasper walked him down to the lower road and cut him loose with a clear description of what awaited him if he rode back toward Vance. Gideon watched her work in the evenings. He didn't interrupt. He understood the difference between someone thinking and someone stuck, and Eva was always thinking. On the 4th evening, he set a cup of coffee beside her hand, without a word, and she reached for it without looking up, and he sat across from her and read the territory surveying pamphlet she'd already finished with, and they existed in that particular quiet they'd made for themselves over 6 months of cold Montana nights. She looked up at some point. He was watching the cave entrance. Not her, but his shoulder, the good one, was angled toward her in the way it always was now, like a compass finding north. We have the documents, she said. We have Creed's statement. We have the Cree testimony. She paused. What we don't have yet is proof that the arrest warrant was fabricated on Vance's orders. Malachi signed it, Gideon said. Malachi signed it because Vance told him to. Proving that chain of instruction in a federal court is different from knowing it. She set her pen down. We need something that connects them directly, a letter, a payment record, an order. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Creed mentioned a ledger. She looked at him fully. When? Second day. You were asleep. He said Vance keeps a ledger of payments to officials, county judge, territorial surveyor, 3 land agents. He met her eyes. Malachi's name is in it. Where is the ledger? Vance's office in Helena. She picked up her pen again. All right, she said. They came out of the mountains on the morning of the 6th day, 5 of them. Bart moving slower than usual, but moving without complaint. The south stand was gone, a wide black scar in the timber, the burned stumps still standing like the aftermath of a very specific grief. Eva rode past it, without looking away. She looked at all of it. You didn't fix things by refusing to see them. The cabin was standing. She hadn't known if it would be. Malachi's men had smashed the door in and gone through it. That was clear from the yard, from the things scattered on the porch, but they hadn't burned it. Maybe they'd needed it as a base. Maybe Vance had wanted it intact to claim. It didn't matter. It was standing, and the roof was whole, and when Bart put the door back on its hinges and they walked inside, the main hearth was cold, but the structure was solid. Boston the foal was in the barn, skittish but unharmed. Bart went to check on him first, before he checked on his own ribs. They had one night at the cabin, one night to resupply and sleep in actual beds and prepare for what came next. Thad made venison stew from what was still in the root cellar, and they ate around the main table the way they'd eaten all winter. And Eva sat in her chair with the wooden ring on her finger and looked at the map on the wall with all of Gideon's red ink marks and thought about everything they were about to walk into. The ledger, she said. 4 men looked at her. I need it before we go to court. Without it, we can prove Vance committed land fraud. We can prove the documents were forged, but we can't prove Malachi is his instrument, rather than an independent authority acting in good faith. She looked around the table. If Malachi argues good faith, the arrest warrant has to be taken seriously by the judge, regardless of everything else. You want us to go into Vance's Helena office, Jasper said. I want to go into Vance's Helena office, she said. Someone who works there needs to hand it to me voluntarily. Silence. Voluntarily, Gideon repeated. A person who understands that the syndicate is already a federal case and that cooperation is considerably better than association. She looked at Jasper. I need to know who works in that building who might be persuaded. Jasper thought. Vance has a bookkeeper. An older man. Local. He's been in Helena since before Vance arrived. He was the territorial land registrar for 12 years before Vance hired him away. He paused. His name is Emmett Cole. He went to school in Vermont, Methodist. He has a granddaughter in the Helena Day School. How do you know that? Thad said. I track things, Jasper said, not just animals. Eva nodded. Emmett Cole, she said. I'll talk to him. She went in with Jasper again. The next morning, before the others moved toward Helena on the main road, she went in on foot from the east, no disguise this time. She was done with disguises. She was Evangeline Blackwood. She had a federal filing number and a date with the circuit court, and she was finished small. Vance's Helena office was a 2-story brick building on the main commercial block. She went in through the front door. The clerk at the reception desk looked at her with the particular alarm of someone who recognizes a problem arriving. I need to speak with Emmett Cole, she said. Please tell him Evangeline Blackwood is here regarding the federal case against Sterling Vance. Tell him it will take 15 minutes and that it is very much in his interest. The clerk went. Emmett Cole was 62 years old and had a face that had been doing math for 4 decades, the kind of face where you could see the calculation happening behind the eyes at all times. He came down the stairs and looked at her and did his calculation and brought her into a side room, That was probably meant for client meetings. He closed the door. "You're the woman from the warrant," he said. "The warrant was fraudulent," she said. "We filed the documentation proving that with the Federal Circuit Court 11 days ago. The case against the Vance Syndicate for land fraud, document forgery, and unlawful interference with a federal homestead filing is already in the record." She sat down. "How long have you worked for Sterling Vance, Mr. Cole?" 7 years, he said slowly. "In 7 years, have you ever falsified a document at his direction?" He was very still. "I'm not asking to use it against you," she said. "I'm asking so I know where you stand." She paused. "Because a man who spent 12 years as the territorial land registrar before this understands property law. He understands what fraudulent filings mean and what happens to the people attached to them." She looked at him steadily. "I think you've been uncomfortable for a while." Cole looked at the closed door, then back at her. "He keeps a ledger," he said. "Payments to officials. Amounts, dates, names." His voice was flat and careful. "It's in the upper office. Second drawer of the left filing cabinet. The key is on the ring he keeps on his desk." "Is he in the building today?" "He rode south yesterday evening. He hasn't come back." Cole's jaw shifted. "He left when the Helena filing came through. Someone told him Vance was running." She'd expected that might happen. Cowardice was the common denominator in men who operated through proxies. "Mr. Cole," she said, "do you want to hand me that ledger, or would you like me to obtain it through the court?" He looked at her one more moment. Then he stood up. He brought her the ledger himself. It was a slim brown book, very ordinary looking, the kind of ledger you could buy at any stationer in any city. Inside were columns of names and numbers and dates in a precise, careful hand. Malachi's name appeared 11 times over 4 years. The county judge appeared 8 times. The territorial surveyor appeared 14 times. It was the most useful thing she'd held in 6 months. More useful than the Homestead Act filing, even, because documents protected the land. This destroyed the man who'd been taking it. "You should speak with the federal prosecutor before the hearing," she told Cole. "Tell him you came forward voluntarily. It matters." "Will it matter enough?" he said. "It matters more than staying silent," she said. She walked out of Vance's building with the ledger under her arm, and Jasper fell into step beside her on the street, and they walked 3 blocks before either of them said anything. "Vance is gone," she said. "I know," he said. "Heard it at the livery. He rode south with 2 men 2 days ago." "He'll be found," she said. "Federal warrant in a territory this size, he'll be found." Jasper looked at the mountains visible at the end of the street, blue and enormous against the sky. "You sound certain." "He has nowhere to go that's outside the law's reach now," she said. "That's what happens when you build your whole life on other people's land and other people's silence. The second the silence breaks, there's nothing under you." The others met them at the federal building. All 4 of them, Bart moving steady, Gideon's shoulder in a sling he'd been told to wear, and was wearing without complaint because Thad had been very specific about the consequences if he didn't. They stood on the steps in the Helena afternoon light, and she showed them the ledger and watched their faces. Gideon looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Where did you get it?" "From a man who had the courage to do something difficult," she said. "Emmett Cole, remember that name? He's going to need people to speak well of him when this is over." Gideon nodded. He didn't ask any more questions about how she'd done it. He trusted her methods the way she trusted his. They had 2 days before the hearing. The Cree elder's daughter, whose name was Susanna, and who had ridden into Helena the day before, had organized accommodations through a network of homesteader families who knew the Blackwood name and what it meant. They stayed in a farm household on the edge of the city, 3 families sharing a large house, wood fires burning, children running between rooms. The homesteaders fed them and asked nothing beyond the news of what was happening at the circuit court. They gave it freely. An older man with a Nebraska accent and collar-used hands found her at the farm on the second evening. He introduced himself as a homesteader who'd lost a land claim to Vance's syndicate 4 years ago and had been unable to afford the legal challenge. "I heard you have documentation of the fraud," he said. "Everything he did?" "Yes," she said. "If I testify," he said. "If others like me testify. Does it help your case?" She looked at him. He had the same look her father's clients had in Boston. The look of people who had played by the rules and had the rules used against them. "It strengthens it significantly," she said, "especially regarding pattern of conduct. A judge can dismiss one incident as a dispute. He cannot dismiss 12. The man nodded. "I'll find you 11 more by morning," he said. He did. Justice, her father had told her once, is the harvest of sown kindness. The Blackwood brothers had spent years on this mountain treating people fairly, treating them as people, paying honest wages, lending a hand without putting a price on it, standing between the weak and the people who wanted to take from them. And now, when it mattered, those people were standing up, not because they were owed something, because they chose to. She sat up late on the eve of the hearing and organized everything. Documents in order. Witness statements in sequence. The ledger flagged at the relevant pages. Cole's address noted for the prosecutor's use. She'd been trained by her father to prepare a case the way you prepare a foundation, thorough, level, nothing left to chance. At some point, Gideon came and sat across from her and set down a cup of coffee. "You should sleep," he said. "1 more hour," she said. He stayed. He always stayed. When she finally set the pen down and looked at the stack of organized papers in front of her, she felt something she hadn't felt since before Boston. Before the fire and the loss and the long, terrible year of watching her family come apart, she felt ready. The Federal Circuit Court of Helena was not built to impress. It was a square room with high windows, wooden benches, and a raised platform at the front where Judge Elias Harmon sat with the particular stillness of a man who had presided over hard cases in hard territories for 20 years and had stopped being surprised by human behavior sometime around the first decade. He was 60, maybe, gray. He wore his authority the way serious people wore it, without decoration. The room was full. Eva had not expected the room to be full. But the homesteaders had come. Susanna's people had come. 3 territorial newspaper reporters were in the back row. A federal prosecutor named Walsh, who had been very interested in the Vance ledger and had been working since the previous evening, sat at the table to her left. She sat with Gideon on her right, Thad, Jasper, and Bart behind the rail. Malachi was at the opposing table. He had a lawyer from Butte, expensive-looking, with the smooth confidence of a man who had argued in courts where his clients were always presumed right. He didn't look at her when she came in. He was doing paperwork, pen-scratching, all very busy. She put her documents on the table in precise order and waited. Judge Harmon called the room to order without raising his voice. "This hearing concerns 2 matters," he said. "The criminal charges filed against Evangeline Blackwood and the federal countercomplaint filed against the Vance Mining Syndicate by the Blackwood Homestead Partnership." He looked at both tables. "We'll proceed in order." Prosecutor Walsh, on the countercomplaint. Walsh was efficient. He'd done his work. He presented the documents, the original filings, the forged boundary surveys, the amended claims in clean sequence, annotating each one with reference to the relevant federal statutes. He presented 3 expert witnesses on land records. He presented the Cree testimony. He presented 7 of the 12 homesteaders who had come forward, each of them giving clear account of what Vance's syndicate had done to their claims and when. It took 2 hours. Harmon listened to every word. Then Malachi's lawyer stood up. He was smooth. She'd given him that in the farm kitchen last night, and she gave it to him now. He moved through his argument with the ease of a man who had practiced it many times. The Blackwood claim was irregular. The legal marriage was suspect. The chain of title was incomplete. The countercomplaint relied on documents of questionable provenance, and as for the witnesses' homesteaders, a Cree community, people with obvious grievances against his client, their credibility was, naturally, a matter for the court to weigh. He made it sound reasonable. He was good at that. Then he turned to the criminal charges against Eva. He produced the arrest warrant. He produced a statement from a Beaverhead County deputy, not Malachi. Someone further removed, attesting to what they'd observed at the Blackwood cabin. He used words like impropriety and moral character and the responsibilities of a woman in a legal capacity. He built the picture carefully, not crude, calculated. She watched Harmon's face while he talked. The judge was watching the lawyer, with the attention of a man who was hearing something he recognized. Malachi's lawyer finished. He sat down with the composure of someone who believed he'd done well. Harmon looked at Eva. "Mrs. Blackwood, you wish to respond?" She stood. The room was very quiet. She looked at the homesteaders on the benches, Susanna in the second row, the reporters with their notebooks, Walsh at his table, Harmon on his platform above all of it. She looked at Gideon beside her, his shoulder in its sling, his face composed, his eyes on her completely. She turned to face the room. "Your Honor, the prosecution has asked this court to accept two ideas at once," she said. "The first is that the documents we filed are unreliable. The second is that the arrangement of my household is immoral. I'd like to address both." Her voice was clear. It carried to the back wall. On the documents, the plaintiff has presented no evidence that they were falsified because they were not falsified. What the plaintiff has done is suggest that their provenance is questionable because the people who provided them are not wealthy, not white in all cases, and not aligned with Sterling Vance's business interests. She paused. "I would submit to this court that none of those things are legal disqualifiers for testimony or documentation. They are social preferences disguised as legal arguments." She heard a sound from the benches. Not loud, just present, on the question of my character and my household. She looked at Harmon directly. "I have been called immoral by a man who works for someone who forged federal land surveys. I have been called a prostitute by a legal instrument signed by a sheriff whose name appears 11 times in a payment ledger belonging to Sterling Vance." She lifted the ledger and set it on the table facing the judge. "The ledger is Exhibit 14 in the federal counter-complaint record, Your Honor. I recommend the relevant pages." Harmon's eyes went to the ledger. Malachi's lawyer was on his feet. "Objection, that document has not been properly entered." "It was entered yesterday morning by Prosecutor Walsh," Eva said. "The court record will confirm that." Walsh nodded. "Confirmed, Your Honor." Harmon looked at Malachi's lawyer with an expression that was not quite impatience, but was not far from it. "Sit down, counselor." He sat. Eva looked at the room again. She had planned this. She had written it and rewritten it in the farm kitchen while Gideon sat across from her in the lamplight. But what came out now was not exactly what she'd written. What came out was all of its 6 months of mountains and cold and trust, built slowly in firelight, and everything she'd lost in Boston, and everything she'd found on a mountain she hadn't planned to love. "You call this immorality because these men do not own me like property?" Her voice was steady, completely steady. "Out there, amid blizzards and your hired guns, these 4 men taught me respect, equality, and protection. They see me as a free human being. Our love violates no law. It simply transcends the selfishness you disguise as morality." The room was absolutely still. "My father defended 43 families against syndicates like this one," she continued. "He did it because he believed that a person's rights do not change based on who they are or where they come from or who they choose to love. He believed that the law, properly applied, exists to protect people from power, not to give power an instrument to protect itself." She looked at Malachi, who was looking at the table. "The arrest warrant issued against me was written by a man being paid by the person I was filing against. That is not law enforcement. That is organized intimidation, wearing a badge." She put both hands on the table. "I am asking this court to do what courts are built to do. Look at the evidence, follow it where it leads, and recognize that justice isn't what happens when powerful men agree. It's what happens when the truth is stronger than what they want to hide." She sat down. The room exhaled. Harmon looked at her for a long moment. Then, he looked at the documents in front of him. He spent 45 minutes reading. No one spoke. The reporters in the back row had stopped writing and were simply watching. One of the homesteaders on the bench had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes closed. Harmon set the last document down. Regarding the criminal charges against Evangeline Blackwood, he said, this court finds no credible legal basis for the warrant as filed. The connection between the signing authority and the opposing party in the federal complaint constitutes a conflict of interest that invalidates the instrument. All charges are dismissed. She heard Bart's breath from behind the rail. Regarding the federal counter-complaint against Vance Mining Syndicate, Harmon continued. The documentation presented is consistent. The witness testimony is credible, and the payment ledger constitutes direct evidence of official corruption. This court refers the full matter to the federal prosecutor's office with a recommendation for criminal indictment. He set his pen down. I am further issuing federal arrest warrants for Sterling Vance on charges of land fraud, document forgery, and bribery of public officials. He looked at Malachi's table, and for Sheriff Malachi on charges of accepting bribes and abuse of official authority. Malachi stood up. His lawyer grabbed his arm and said something fast and quiet. Malachi sat back down. Two federal marshals, who had been standing at the back of the room, came forward. Eva watched it happen. She watched Malachi's face when the marshals reached his table. He looked the way men looked when the architecture of their impunity collapsed, surprised, even though they shouldn't have been. Even though it had been coming for a long time. She turned to Gideon. He was already looking at her. He had been looking at her through all of it, she realized. Through every word. Just present, just watching. The way he watched everything that mattered to him. It's done, she said. Yes, he said. Thad put his hand on her shoulder from behind, brief and warm. Jasper said nothing. But when she looked at him, his eyes were completely open, nothing held back. Just that clear, honest face she'd learned to read, like weather. Bart, behind him, was standing straight despite his ribs, his huge frame still, his expression carrying the weight of everything they'd survived to get to this room. Walsh shook her hand on the way out. He said she'd constructed the cleanest chain of evidence he'd encountered in a frontier filing and asked if she'd ever considered a formal legal career. She said she was considering a great many things. On the courthouse steps, in the Helena afternoon, the homesteaders came forward, not to congratulate her, just to be present. The man from Nebraska found her and said two men had already identified a fourth witness willing to testify in the Vance criminal case when it went to trial. Susanna told her the elder was well and sent her word of what she called a debt paid in the right direction. Eva stood on those steps and looked at the mountains above the Helena Basin, massive and indifferent and permanent. She thought about her father in Providence, about the letter she'd written him 3 days ago, not knowing how the hearing would go, telling him what they were about to attempt. She would write him again tonight. She would tell him every detail. She thought he would understand, better than almost anyone, what this day had actually been about. Not victory. Not exactly. Something more durable than victory. A record. A true one. In a federal ledger that couldn't be forged, couldn't be burned, couldn't be bought away by men in expensive hats who had confused wealth with permanence. The truth, properly documented, in a place where it had to be answered. Her father had spent 30 years believing that was possible. She had spent 6 months learning he was right. Gideon came and stood beside her on the steps. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She could feel him there, solid and steady. The same presence he'd been since a frozen station in a blizzard, when he'd put his coat around her without asking. She reached out and took his hand. He held it. They stood there until the afternoon light went long and gold over the mountains. And then they went to find the others. And they went home. Spring came to the Bitterroot the way it always did not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of small surrenders by the cold. The creek ran high and clear. The south stand, the burn section, put up green shoots through the black ground by the second week of April, thin and tentative, reaching for the light in the particular stubborn way of things that had been told they were finished and hadn't believed it. Bart noticed them first. He came inside one morning and said simply, "South Stand's coming back," and that was all that needed to be said about it. The cabin had been rebuilt through March and into April, not repaired, rebuilt. Gideon and Bart had taken the door explosion as an invitation to fix everything that had been impractical from the beginning, which turned out to be considerable. The main room expanded by 8 feet to the east. The porch was reinforced and widened. A second fireplace went in on the north wall for when the cooking fire and the main hearth weren't enough. New bookshelves, proper ones from mountain ash timber, that Bart cut and planed and fitted with the patient exactness he brought to everything he built. Eva's room upstairs became 2 rooms. She didn't ask for that. She came home from a week of correspondence in Helena, managing the formal legal filings from the Vance criminal case, which was proceeding through the federal system with Walsh at the helm, to find the wall repositioned and a larger window cut in the south face of the second room, with a view of the mountains that made her stand there for a full minute without saying anything. "You needed a working space," Gideon said from behind her. "That isn't it." He nodded toward the first room, which was clearly the sleeping room, and then toward the second. "That is." She looked at the desk he'd built under the window, at the shelving beside it, already holding her law books in the order she kept them. At the south view, the mountains, the valley, the long green of a Montana spring, reaching all the way to the horizon. "Gideon." "It needed doing," he said. She turned. He was standing in the doorway with the afternoon light behind him and the scar along his jaw that she could now read the way she read everything else about him, as evidence, as history, as the record of everything he'd survived to stand there. "Thank you," she said. "You've said that before," he said. "I'll keep saying it." The almost smile, all the way this time. She'd been writing to her father twice a week since the hearing. His letters back were coming from Providence with a new quality to them. Steadier, she thought, or maybe just less careful. He'd been careful with her for years before Montana, handling her like something fragile. She understood now that what he'd been handling was grief, his own, at what the syndicate had taken from them. He hadn't wanted her to carry it. She carried it anyway. She'd just carried it somewhere useful. His April letter said his health was better. His sister-in-law had found him a part-time position, advising a Providence law firm on property matters. He said it was less than what he'd had, and more than enough to keep him occupied. He said he was proud of her in a way that took 3 full paragraphs, and still, she thought, didn't quite say all of it. She wrote back, "Come visit in summer. Bring mother's sister if she'll come. Pass opens in June, and there are 5 people here who want to meet you." She hadn't told him everything. Not yet. Some things needed to be said in person, around a table, with coffee and enough time to say it properly. Summer was coming. There would be time. The baby announcement happened in the second week of May, which was when Thad told her what she'd already suspected for 6 weeks, but had wanted confirmed before she said anything to anyone. He was professional about it, as he was professional about everything medical. She sat in the medical corner with the oil lamp, and he did what he needed to do, then sat back and said, Approximately late November. Give or take 2 weeks." She looked at him. He looked at her. Then he smiled, not the quiet professional smile, the real one, the one that reached all the way up, that she'd only seen a handful of times and treasured each one. "Eva," he said, and his voice had something in it she didn't have a word for. "This is a good thing, I know," she said. She wasn't afraid of it. She was aware of that clearly. 6 months ago she might have been, for all the reasons a woman alone in an uncertain situation might be. But she was not alone, and the situation was not uncertain, and she knew exactly who surrounded her and what they were made of. I know, it's a good thing. She told all four of them that evening around the supper table. She'd planned to say it simply and plainly, which was how she said everything now. She said, Thad confirmed this afternoon that I'm expecting, late November. The table went quiet. Gideon set his fork down. Thad was already watching the others, reading the room the way he always read rooms. Jasper looked at her with his walls all the way down, the way she'd seen him look in the south stand, and in the cave, and on the courthouse steps. Open, present, genuinely glad. Bart said nothing for a moment. His face went through something complicated and arrived somewhere, very calm and warm. Then he reached over and picked up her hand from the table and held it in both of his for a moment and set it back down. That was all. It was enough. Gideon looked at her across the table. She met his eyes. They'd gotten very good at entire conversations that didn't need words. This one said, whatever comes, we meet it the same way we've met everything. Together, honestly, without pretending it's simpler than it is or harder than it is. She nodded. He picked his fork back up. Thad started talking about diet and rest and what to expect in the first months, practically and without drama, because that was who he was. Jasper asked questions, good ones. The kind that revealed he'd been thinking about it since she said it. Bart listened to all of it, and then went outside after supper and came back an hour later, with measurements he'd taken from the corner of the main room, which Eva recognized as the beginning of whatever he was planning to build next. Life on the mountain in the summer was different from winter. Not easier. Exactly, the work was different, not less. The pasture needed tending. The cattle needed moving. The fence lines needed checking after the spring runoff had undermined them in places. The new timber in the south stand needed protection from the elk that had discovered the young shoots. There were federal case correspondence to manage, because the Vance criminal trial was proceeding, and Walsh sent her documents every 2 weeks requiring her review. But the days were long. The light lasted until 9. The valley below the cabin turned a shade of green that she hadn't been able to imagine in February, when everything was white, and the cold made color seem like a rumor. She started a journal, not a legal notebook, not correspondence, not documentation, a personal journal. The first entry was dated May 18th and read, in her careful hand, I came to Montana running. I have not stopped moving, but I am no longer running. There is a difference. I am beginning to understand it. She wrote in it most evenings, in the new working room with the south window and the mountain view, while the sounds of the cabin moved around her, Thad and Jasper at the main table arguing about something, Bart's tools from the expanding work shed, Gideon on the porch, watching the valley with his coffee. She wrote about the legal case and the homesteaders who'd testified and what she thought they might do. Collectively, about the larger question of how the territory's land laws applied to people who didn't have the money to enforce their rights. She wrote about what she wanted to build. Not just the cabin and the claim. A practice, a method, a way of doing what her father had spent 30 years doing. But from inside the territory, from inside the community, with the knowledge of what this land actually was to the people who lived on it. She wrote about her father, about the moment in his office when the fire started, and she'd gone back for the files without thinking, and the heat had been enormous, and she'd gotten most of them. She wrote about why that had mattered. The files weren't just paper. They were proof. They were the difference between a family keeping what they'd built and losing it to people who counted on nothing being documented. She'd understood that at 21, with her hands burning, and she still understood it at 23, with a baby coming, and a mountain she'd learned to call home. She wrote about the 4 men in the rooms below and around her, and what each of them had taught her without calling it teaching. Gideon had taught her that strength and tenderness were not opposites, that the most formidable people she'd ever met were the ones who chose, deliberately, not to use their power against the people they could have. Thad had taught her that care was a practice, not a feeling, That showing up for people, specifically and practically, was the thing itself, not the intention. Jasper had taught her to read what was actually there, not what she'd been told should be there, not what it was convenient to see, just what was real, straight on, without flinching. Bart had taught her what it looked like when a person expressed love in the most honest language they had. She would spend the rest of her life recognizing it in people who didn't know how to say the words, but knew how to fix the staircase, knew how to carve the ring, knew how to put their body between danger and the people they chose. She wrote the last entry on a warm September evening, the mountains turning gold outside the south window, the smell of Thad's cooking drifting up through the floorboards. She wrote, "A person's worth is not measured by their origin, gender, or wealth, but by their courage to protect those they love and live truthfully in freedom." My father tried to tell me this for 23 years. It took a Montana blizzard and 4 extraordinary people for me to understand it all the way down. She closed the journal. The baby came in late November, which was exactly when Thad had said it would, because Thad was almost never wrong about those things. She labored through a night and most of a morning, and all 4 men were somewhere in the cabin the entire time she was aware of that, aware of Thad close and steady beside her the whole way, aware of the others cycling through the doorway with water and firewood, and once, memorably, Bart appearing with a bowl of soup at 4 in the morning, because he'd decided she needed it, and she had, in fact, needed it. The baby was small and loud, and had a great deal of dark hair and opinions about the world that she expressed immediately and at volume. Gideon held her first, which happened because he was closest when Thad said it was time. He held her with the careful steadiness he brought to everything fragile, and his face did something Eva had never seen it do before. He looked undone. Just for a moment, wide open, not the controlled man with the scar and the revolver and the 6 years of military silence. Just a man holding a new person and being completely present in it. Then he looked at Eva. She looked back at him from where she was, tired and clear-eyed and more awake in some fundamental way than she'd been in 23 years. They named her Margaret, after Eva's mother. Maggie immediately, because Bart said Margaret was a large name for a small person, and she would grow into it, but she needed something to start with. By spring, Maggie had expressed strong preferences about several things. She preferred Jasper's voice to the others for settling at night, which Jasper accepted with great seriousness, as if this were a professional responsibility. She preferred Bart's shoulder to any other surface for sleeping, which Bart also accepted with seriousness, though his was tinged with a quiet pride that he tried not to show and failed at entirely. She tolerated Thad's medical examinations with the practiced patience of someone who understood they were necessary. She saved her most concentrated attention for Gideon, watching him across the room with the focused intent of someone gathering data. Smart, her mother thought. Right from the beginning, the following year, when the wildflowers came back to the valley, and the south stand was knee-high with new timber, and the cabin had been expanded twice, and the legal practice Eva was building had its 3rd client from the homesteader community that year. On a warm May evening, all 5 of them stood on the porch. Gideon had his coffee. Thad had his book, held loosely, not really reading. Jasper was watching the elk on the far pasture edge. Bart had Maggie, who was walking now in the determined and occasionally catastrophic way of 1-year-olds, and was tracking her progress across the porch boards with the attention he gave all his most important projects. Eva stood at the porch railing and looked at the valley and the mountains beyond it, gold in the long evening light. She thought about the stagecoach, the frozen station, 2 men who'd tried to crowd her, and the one who'd stepped out of the shadows and put his coat around her shoulders without ceremony. She thought about the sealed mountain pass, and the long winter, and the documents spread on the table, and the south stand in February light, and the fever, and the trial, and all of it. Every piece. She thought about what you became when people chose to see you clearly, and you chose to see them the same way back. Maggie pulled free of Bart's careful hand and walked 3 very determined steps toward the railing and grabbed Eva's leg with both fists and looked up at her with Gideon's eyes and Eva's jaw and some expression that was entirely her own. Eva looked down at her. Maggie said something that was almost a word. "I know," Eva said. "It's beautiful." She picked her daughter up and held her against her shoulder and looked at the mountains and the valley and the last gold light running all the way to the horizon, warm and permanent and full of everything they'd built while they were fighting for it. Behind her, someone Thad started talking about something, some spring planting question, and Jasper answered, and Gideon said something low in response, and Bart laughed. Just the ordinary sound of an evening. Of people who had chosen each other and kept choosing. She turned around. 4 men on a porch in the Montana evening, coffee going cold, and a book left open, an elk on the far pasture, and a little girl reaching for the nearest available shoulder. Her family, not the one she'd planned. Not the one Boston had given her a language for. The one she'd built, piece by piece, in the coldest winter of her life, with people who had taught her that love wasn't a scarcity you allocated carefully. It was a practice, a daily one. You showed up for it, and you kept showing up, and eventually it became the most solid thing you owned. She walked back to the group of them, Maggie on her hip, and the porch held all of them the way it had been built, to strong and level and wide enough for everything that mattered. The sun dropped behind the western peaks. The mountains stayed exactly where they were, and on the Blackwood homestead at Whispering Pines, in the last warm light of a Montana spring, the day ended the way all the best ones did. Quietly, together, real. And so, on that quiet porch overlooking the Bitterroot Valley, with the mountains standing gold and eternal in the evening light, Eva's story reminds us of something we often forget in a world obsessed with appearances and easy judgments: that a person's true worth is never measured by where they come from, how much they own, or what society expects them to be, but by the courage they show in protecting the people they love and the honesty with which they choose to live. Eva came to Montana running from loss, from betrayal, from a world that had already decided who she was allowed to become. What she found instead was a mountain that didn't care about her family name, and 4 men who saw her not as property to be claimed, but as a person to be respected. That distinction between ownership and partnership, between control and trust, is the quiet heartbeat of this entire story. Gideon, Thad, Jasper, and Bart never demanded anything from her. They simply showed up, again and again, in these small, unglamorous ways that actually matter: mending a staircase, carving a ring, sitting through a fever, standing between danger and the woman they'd chosen to care for. Love, this story tells us, is rarely a grand declaration. More often, it's a practice, something built one honest day at a time, through blizzards and burned timber and long nights with no fire. There's also something deeply American frontier in the justice Eva fights for. Not vengeance, but documentation. Not fury alone, but truth, properly recorded, in a system that, however flawed, could still be made to answer when the evidence was undeniable. Her father spent 30 years believing the law could protect the powerless if only someone had the courage to hold it accountable. Eva proved him right, not with a gun, though there was a place for that too, but with patience, preparation, and an unshakable belief that the truth, once spoken plainly and without apology, is harder to bury than any fire, any warrant, any man with money, and a badge in his pocket. Perhaps the deepest lesson here is this: family is not always the one you're born into or the one society hands you a script for. Sometimes it's the one you build through winters survived together, through trust earned in silence, through people who choose you and keep choosing you long after the novelty has worn off. That kind of love doesn't need anyone's permission. It just needs honesty, patience, and the will to keep showing up. Thank you for spending this time in the world of Whispering Pines. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, names, events, and situations depicted are entirely products of imagination and are not based on real people or actual historical events. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to actual events is purely coincidental. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only.